So when I was about 10 years old, I decided I wanted to try my first cigarette. And as it turns out, I decided during a week that my mother was actually hospitalized. Now, I lived in a very small town in South Alabama, about 2,000 people. And so the hospital was 1 block from our house. My mother was in the hospital there. During the day, I had this whole scheme about how I was going to have my first cigarette. And so I was at my friend's house next door, whose mother smoked, and so I stole a pack of cigarettes. I was going to sort of tuck them away until there was the perfect opportunity for me to smoke. Well, it turns out that that evening was that opportunity, and so my dad went to the hospital to see my mother, and I went out in the backyard with the pack of cigarettes and a match. God, goodness. And how dangerous was that? And I stood out in our backyard with a big floodlight shining right down on me. And I lit up. So I'm smoking away, coughing my brains out. You know, I don't know anything about smoking, but I think I'm really cool. And all of a sudden, out of the shadows of a tree, I hear my daddy's voice. Lily Ruth Brock, what do you think you are doing? So, my first temptation was cigarettes. That's enough to make it be your last, let me just say, right? And so I had this fear moment that my dad, with this big voice, this big booming voice coming out of the dark, had caught me. Well, no kidding, caught me. I'm under the spotlight. How could he not catch me, right? And so there is this thing we call temptation. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Please pray with me. Holy One, we thank you for this moment. We thank you for the presence of your Spirit. We call this holy ground. And so I ask now that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts might rise up, and they'll meet you, and you will be pleased. May it be so in your many names, and in the name of all that is holy. Amen. Amen. So I think that this passage inside the Lord's Prayer has been mostly used to really beat up on people about temptation and evil and the devil and hell, right? I saw a church sign not too long ago, right here in Sarasota. I was driving by, that says, read the Bible, it'll scare hell out of you. So I'm not really inclined to scare hell out of you, but I do know that the dozens of sermons I've ever heard on this passage did have a tendency to do just that, try to scare hell out of you. Now, maybe some of you need that, but that's not what we're going to do today, at least. I want us to think a little more deeply about this issue of temptation and of evil. As we've been doing throughout this series, you've heard many different translations and interpretations of the Lord's Prayer. I just read one this week by Jean Crane. She is a pastor and theologian, and one of the ways that she interpreted this particular phrase was to say, lead us not into the illusion of separation, or into the temptation of our ego. Can I say that again? Lead us not into the illusion of separation or the temptation of our ego. I happen to really love that because there are two big themes in this particular phrase, obviously, temptation and evil. And so what do we do with that? In her words, temptation is really about buying into an illusion that we are somehow separate from one another. And that evil is when we allow our ego to get in the way in such a big way that we actually participate in being separate. So maybe an easier way to say that is we get really full of ourselves and we participate fully in becoming separate. So what if this prayer, through the eyes of Jesus, is really something different than scaring hell out of you? What if it's something more and something deeper? I have been harping on this for weeks and weeks. I'm sure you're getting sick of it. But the first century Jesus, that Jesus, not the one that you've probably been told a lot about, but the first century Jesus was the Jesus who constantly was trying to bring people together who were separate. He was willing to sit with the woman at the well when no one else at the well would sit with her. They scattered once she showed up. He was willing to be with the blind man and the beggar who had been outcast on the outskirts of town. He was willing to forgive even the sinners who died on the cross, the murderers, the thieves. He didn't see a distinction between himself and the people that others said were not worthy. You see that connection as opposed to separation. And so this idea that if we hear the Lord's Prayer, the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray, then we have to hear that our real work is in building bridges, not barriers. Did you hear the Black Panther, the King of Wakanda, saying that the wise build bridges while the foolish build barriers? Somehow I think that's probably what Jesus was trying to say, is to be wise and not be tempted to be a fool. Be wise and build bridges. Don't be tempted to be a fool and build barriers. Well, as you can imagine, as I started to think about bridges, I started looking up stuff about bridges. You know, Google's a wonderful thing, right? And perhaps one of the most famous bridges, not only in our country, but in the world, is the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. How many of you have seen it? Yeah, so a tremendous sight, isn't it, when you actually come up on it? The history of the building of that bridge is that there was some desire among the communities on the San Francisco side and then on the Oakland side to build a bridge that would join the two communities. But like always, there were also all these voices that did not want to do that. And they had well-formed opinions as to why that bridge should never be built. They were really good reasons. And these were the voices of where the barriers are. Now, before we're too hard on those people, because we love and enjoy the Golden Gate Bridge today, but before we're too hard on them, how many of us do the same thing? When there is a possibility to connect things, to bring things from separation to connection, how many of us are guilty of participating in all the reasons that it's just too hard for connection to be made? It requires a lot of us to stay connected to each other. It requires a lot of us to stay connected to God. And goodness knows it requires a lot of us to stay connected to ourselves. So the voices around "don't build this bridge" said, you know, this is treacherous water here. Because what the bridge was going to do was to cross over a very rough part of water where the Pacific Ocean meets the San Francisco Bay. Very rough water. This was an excellent reason not to put hundreds of lives at risk trying to build this bridge, right? No one really thought that there was a way to put the pylons deep enough and the concrete thick enough to enable this bridge to actually stand with the treacherous water, let alone a hurricane or let alone an earthquake. So treacherous was a reasonable argument. Also, in the San Francisco Bay, it's very foggy. And so the naysayers said, you know what, ships are going to come by here, and it's going to be foggy, and they're not going to be able to see the bridge, and they're going to run right into it. And so they had to develop a really ingenious way to try to mitigate that in order to build the bridge. But the fog was a real thing. It was really a possibility that you would not be able to see and be safe if you were traversing it on a ship. I had the opportunity to leave on a cruise out of San Francisco and go on a big cruise ship under the Golden Gate Bridge. And I'm going to tell you, all the way up till we were under it, I thought we were going to hit the bridge. I mean, it's sort of this illusion. So this whole fog thing is real. It's also true that there was some politics. Imagine that. Politics on both sides of the bay about whether they really wanted to have this connection and who was going to get the money or who was going to pay the money to have it built. You know, the usual political discussions about it. Still, they stayed with it long enough until they started to build the bridge. It took 5 years. Connection takes time. It takes intention. It takes paying attention long enough and hard enough through every obstacle to still make the connection, to still build the bridge. But nonetheless, 5 years later, it was built. Now, maybe it's a question about what does that mean for us around lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. I think it means that in the simplest terms, when you and I are delivered from evil, it is because we absolutely refuse to be separated. To be separated from God, to be separated from each other, to be separated from people who are not in this room, and to be separated from ourselves. Every time we engage in being separated, we are engaging with what creates evil. Every time we're tempted to get full of ourselves and think that it's really okay to be separate, because you know some people deserve to be separate from us. Or we get full of ourselves and we think, oh my goodness, that person, that situation, those circumstances are way beneath me. And I have no business connecting with that nonsense. Now, I do this all the time, so do you, if you're honest. But once we walk down that path, it's hard to return from a place where you are disconnected to being connected. Once you run down the rabbit hole of disconnection and telling ourselves the whole way that we're justified in doing it, that somebody or something or some situation deserves our disconnection, it's a rabbit hole that's hard to find your way out of. So I want to invite us this morning to just sit and remember that it is an illusion that we're separate. That the truth of the matter is we are always connected to each other. We're not separate. The truth of the matter is we're always connected to the earth. No matter how bad we treat it, we're still connected to it. It's an illusion to think otherwise. We are always connected to other races, other ethnicities, other countries. It is a myth and an illusion to think that we're not. Because in God's world, we are all one tribe. In God's world, we are born to be connected to God, to the earth, to each other, to ourselves. So this week, as you're moving around, moving through the world, notice the number of times that you're tempted to do something that separates you from another person, that separates you from a situation or a circumstance. Just notice. Because I'll bet what you'll find is the same thing that I find, is that I do it many times every single day. And so the rigor is not to stay out of hell. The rigor is to stay connected. The rubrics that we have to go through to stay connected to all that is holy, because in God's world, it is all holy. Everyone is holy, no matter how badly they behave. Every circumstance has holy in it, even when it's really hard to find. I don't know about you, but in our world today, it's hard for me to find it sometimes. But it's all holy in God's world. The first century Jesus seemed to know that being connected was more important than following the rules. Can I repeat that? Being connected was more important than following the rules. Because he broke every rule that we can find. Whether it was a religious rule, you know, the religious leaders got mad at him for healing folks on the Sabbath. So obviously following the rule was more important than healing people. The first century Jesus says, no, not so much. It's more important to heal people. It's more important to connect to their misery, to their disease, to their affliction. It's more important to do that than it is to follow a rule. So as we move through our days, how do we work at remembering that it is an illusion to be separate? And every time we engage that illusion, we run into the possibility that evil begins to creep in. About 20 years ago, no, it's been longer than that. I don't want to go further back than that, but it has been longer than that. Actually, it was April 27th, 1994. This was the first real democratic election that was taken in South Africa. This was after apartheid was over. Apartheid that had lasted 50 years, where there was only separation inside this small little part of Africa. But after 50 years, finally, a truly democratic election was taking place, and I was blessed enough to actually be there on that day in South Africa. And one of the things that I got to do with a friend of mine who lives there was to just drive to some of the polling places and see the literally miles of people lined up to get to vote. Most of them people who had never voted in their whole life. At one of these polling stations, I got out of the car because I was just overwhelmed by a notion that people had never voted. I mean, that's not in my realm as an American. And so I was just sort of walking up and down the lines, and I saw this elderly woman. I later would find out that she was 96 years old. She was a black woman from the Zulu tribe. And she was standing about 2 miles back from the voting booth, but waiting nonetheless for however long she needed to wait to vote for the very first time in her life. I stopped to try and talk to her. I wasn't sure if she spoke any English, and I knew I didn't speak Zulu. And what I discovered was that even though we did not speak one another's language, when I walked up to her and I just smiled at her, she reached out like this and hugged me. Now, I was a white person that she didn't know from anywhere, except that white people had not been very kind to her. But she embraced me, and for a moment, what she engaged was connecting us. We didn't live in the same country. We didn't speak the same language. I didn't know what she'd been through. But in that moment, that embrace was one that said, we can be connected no matter where we've come from. Not to mention the act of voting for the first time in your life when you're 96 years old. All of a sudden, she was no longer separate. All of a sudden, she had a voice in what would happen in her beloved country. All of a sudden, she was connected to what was most important to her. And that was she was a native of South Africa. And she wanted to vote. You know, I stayed with her all the way to the voting booth. We didn't talk. We would smile at each other from time to time, but I just decided I wanted to walk with her. because she had taught me in that moment something about connection. Do you see that that whole encounter could have gone another way? Do you see that we both could have engaged in separation? We could have both made up stories about each other, and not kind ones. I know none of you do that. I know I don't. But we make up stories. You know, she and I could have made up stories to fit some narrative we had about each other. But instead, she initiated connection, and I decided to stay with her. I believe all the way down to my toes and from the deepest parts of my heart that evil is nothing more than us being separated. So this week, I hope you'll engage in being connected. To catch yourself if you're about to jump on the plane that takes you down the rabbit hole of separation. Keep it together, man. Keep it together. Amen.
Amen.